Hey, welcome back. So one thing you'll discover as you get more experience writing code is that in programming, naming things is surprisingly hard. Every name you choose for a thing in your code represents a decision you have to make. And those decisions can be harder than you might think because, as it turns out, the names you choose for things kind of matters. Now, since variables are just names for pieces of data, and we tend to work with variables a lot when we're programming, we will find ourselves deciding on names for variables all of the time. So as such, it's helpful to have a good understanding of both the hard and fast rules, as well as some best practices and guidelines for naming variables in Python. Let's start off with those hard and fast rules. So first of all, variables can only contain letters, numbers, and underscores. But crucially, they can't start with a number. Variables are also case sensitive, meaning my variable, all lowercase, is treated as a different value from my variable with the first letters of each word capitalized. Now, with that said, to avoid confusion, I would strongly recommend not putting this particular feature to the test by having multiple variable names that are identical except for their capitalization. Now, these rules still leave you with a lot of latitude to decide how variables should be named. A little too much, in my opinion. You see, you'll find yourself making lots of these little naming decisions as you code. And if you don't have a system for deciding how to name your variables, the time spent making those decisions can really add up. To solve for this, I recommend following a naming convention for variables that will absolve you from some of this decision making. So two popular naming conventions in programming are camel case and snake case. So starting off, camel case is when the words that make up the variable are all joined together, with the first word being entirely lowercase and the remaining words having their first letter only capitalized. Snake case, by contrast, is when all the words in a variable name are separated by underscores. Now, typically with snake case, all the letters will be lowercase as well. So, which one of these options should you use? I personally recommend snake case. It's more popular within the Python community, it's arguably easier to read and type, and it's also popular in other programming languages. As such, for the sake of consistency, we'll be using snake case throughout this course. Now, using snake case is all fine and good, but keep in mind that the case you use is not as important as the actual name of the variable. It's always a good idea to give your variables meaningful, memorable names that describe what they're used for. For example, if you have a variable that stores a person's age, you could call it something generic like var1. But when you're reading through your code down the road, you'll probably have no earthly idea what the data stored in that variable actually means, which will make it much harder to quickly pick up where you left off and understand what your code is doing. Far superior alternatives here could be age or person_age. Both of those are clear and descriptive. Another important thing to consider is making sure your variable names don't overlap with Python keywords. So in Python, a keyword is a word that already has a special meaning in the language. Some common examples of Python keywords are for, while, in, if, and else, as well as the names of Python functions, like the ones we've already used, print, type, and so on. Now, if you use a keyword as a variable name, Python might think you're trying to use the keyword's special meaning, instead of just using it as a variable. To avoid this confusion, it's best to just avoid using keywords as variable names altogether. Now, fortunately for your sanity, this doesn't require you to actually memorize all the Python keywords. That's because most programming environments where you might type Python code have a feature called syntax highlighting, which formats keywords in a given programming language differently than other words. Now, we haven't seen that so far because we've been writing our code in the Python shell, which is a very bare-bones environment, but we will very soon when we switch over to using an actual code editor. Okay, so to sum up, here are some best practices to keep in mind when you're choosing names for variables in Python. Follow one of the standard cases, like snake or camel. I personally recommend snake, as I mentioned previously. Use meaningful, memorable names to make your code easier to understand. Avoid using Python keywords, aka reserved words, as variable names. And lastly, don't spend too much time deciding on the perfect name. It's not quite as important as, say, choosing a name for your kid. Save yourself time, avoid paralysis by analysis, and use these simple guidelines to quickly choose a name so you can get back to the fun and interesting parts of programming. All right. So admittedly, the code we've written so far has been pretty simple, and we really haven't had to deal with a lot of code errors, to say nothing of debugging those errors. But as our code grows more complex, things won't always be sunshine and rainbows. Errors are just an inevitable fact of any programmer's life. We'll dive into the various ways code can go awry and what to do about it in the next video. See you then.